Iran moved first. Fast boats cut across the bow of a massive oil tanker, forcing the huge vessel to slow in the tight waters of the Gulf. Within seconds, the ship was surrounded, engines humming, small Iranian craft circling close to its steel hull, controlling every meter of distance. In one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, a commercial tanker had just become the center of a military crisis, and for a moment it looked like Iran had seized the initiative. The United States Navy was nearby. A destroyer was already watching the encounter unfold, but it had not moved, which raised the real question. Had Iran just taken control of the confrontation, or had the mistake already begun the moment the tanker stopped moving? The tanker was already slowing, a massive hull drifting in the tight waters of the Gulf, engines still running, but momentum fading. Then the first fast boat cut across the bow, its wake sliced sharply through the gray morning water. Another appeared behind it, then another. Within seconds, the tanker was no longer moving freely. Small Iranian fast attack boats circled close to the hull, their engines loud against the quiet sea. One crossed the tanker's path again, forcing the captain to hold position. This was no routine harassment. The boat stayed tight, too tight for warning maneuvers, too deliberate for simple signaling. What had begun as a shadowing maneuver was becoming something else entirely. The tanker had been seized. Across the narrow waterway, other vessels slowed or altered course. In a place where tankers normally moved in steady lines, the traffic pattern suddenly fractured. Oil shipments that usually passed through these waters daily were now watching one ship become the center of a crisis. Iranian boats tightened their ring. Two held the forward arc. Another hovered near the stern. A fourth boat drifted just off the tanker's flank, close enough to dictate its movement. It looked controlled, deliberate, almost rehearsed. On the surface, Iran had just created leverage in one of the world's most critical waterways. But the Gulf is never empty. Several miles away, a U.S. Navy destroyer held its course. On its bridge, officers were already watching the scene unfold. Through binoculars and sensor feeds, they could see the pattern tightening around the tanker. Fast boats accelerating, distance closing, the geometry of the encounter forming. Inside the Combat Information Center, operators began tracking each moving contact. For the moment, the destroyer did not rush forward. No sudden maneuver, no aggressive broadcast, only observation. Because in a place like the Gulf, the first move rarely decides the encounter, and the ship in the center of the crisis was not the only thing being measured. Iran had seized the tanker. But in the Gulf, taking the ship and controlling the battle space were not the same thing. And the longer the boats held that tanker in place, the more this confrontation was beginning to reveal itself. The fast boats did not leave. Instead, they tightened their movement around the tanker. One accelerated across the bow again, forcing the large vessel to hold its heading. Another idled near the stern, close enough to dictate distance without touching the hull. The tanker now sat in the middle of a moving perimeter, engines humming, water churning lightly around its sides. A massive ship suddenly dependent on the decisions of much smaller ones. And that was the point. In the narrow waters of the Gulf, control does not always belong to the largest vessel. Sometimes it belongs to the one that controls distance. Iranian fast boats were built for exactly this kind of moment. Small, fast, able to close gaps quickly and disappear just as fast. Against a destroyer in open water, they would be dangerously exposed. But here in tight shipping lanes, surrounded by civilian traffic, the rules were not so simple. The tanker itself changed the equation. Because this was not a warship. It was a commercial vessel carrying global cargo. Any sudden escalation around it risked turning a confrontation into a crisis. And everyone in the region understood that. For Iran, the seizure created something far more powerful than the ship itself. It created leverage. A massive steel vessel sitting motionless in a strategic waterway became a symbol visible to every radar screen nearby. Not a battlefield victory, a pressure point. Iranian boats did not need to fire weapons. They only needed to hold the position. As long as the tanker remained under their control, the message was already spreading across the Gulf. Iran could disrupt the flow of one of the world's most critical energy corridors, and that meant every decision now carried weight. Because the United States could not respond recklessly. A destroyer charging forward too quickly could escalate the situation in seconds. Warning shots, collision risks, civilian casualties. All of it was possible in waters this tight. which meant the decision cycle slowed, and every second of hesitation looked like advantage. From the outside, the geometry of the encounter seemed simple. Iranian boats moved. The tanker waited. The destroyer miles away still held its distance. For the crews inside the fast boats, that silence could look like confirmation. They were controlling the tempo. Holding the tanker steady in the water was enough to shape the encounter, because pressure in the Gulf did not always come from weapons. Sometimes it came from forcing the other side to decide how much risk it was willing to take. And for the moment the pressure was working, the tanker remained surrounded. Iranian boats maintained their positions, adjusting distance whenever the ship attempted to move. The scene looked stable, contained, almost routine. On the surface, this was the kind of pressure Iran wanted most: visible, dangerous, and difficult to answer without making the crisis worse. But pressure like this always comes with a hidden cost, because the longer a move like this continues, the more it reveals about the side trying to control it. And somewhere beyond the tanker's towering hull, that process had already begun. Another Iranian boat shifted position. Its engine surged briefly, cutting a curved wake between the tanker and open water. A second boat adjusted a few hundred meters away, matching the movement almost instinctively. From a distance, the scene still looked like a loose swarm. Small boats circling, a tanker sitting still, a tense but static standoff. But inside the U.S. destroyer, the encounter was beginning to look very different. On the bridge watch, officers tracked every change in distance and direction. Inside the Combat Information Center, screens filled with moving symbols. Contacts updating, speeds adjusting, vectors slowly forming patterns. At first glance, the Iranian boats seemed chaotic, but chaos rarely stays chaotic for long, because movement reveals structure. One boat kept returning to the tanker's bow. Another held a steady arc off the stern. Two more shifted constantly along the outer edge, moving just far enough to appear unpredictable. Slowly, the swarm began separating into roles. Perimeter holders, boats that stayed near fixed points around the tanker, maintaining the visible ring of control. Pressure nodes, the ones cutting close across the tanker's path, testing how much movement the ship could make. Decoys, fast boats that drifted outward, drawing attention before sliding back toward the group. And movement testers, boats probing distance, watching how the surrounding ships reacted. What looked like a swarm was becoming something far more readable. And that was the part no one outside the destroyer could see, because every time an Iranian boat repositioned, it revealed a little more about how the operation worked. Every adjustment narrowed the possibilities. Which boat was directing pressure? Which ones were supporting it? Which movements were real control and which were only meant to look dangerous? The longer the tanker remained surrounded, the clearer the structure became. Inside the destroyer's command spaces, officers were not reacting late. They were watching the encounter settle into shape. Ambiguity was shrinking, and with it the number of ways the confrontation could unfold. From the outside, Iran still looked like it controlled the moment. The tanker remained trapped in the water. Fast boats circled close around its hull. But pressure works differently when someone else is measuring it, because pressure creates patterns, and patterns reveal intent. Each Iranian maneuver now did two things at once. It maintained the illusion of control on the surface, and it quietly exposed how that control was actually being maintained. The boats that mattered most were becoming easier to identify. The distance they preferred to hold was becoming predictable. Even the order of their movements was starting to repeat. And that was the moment the encounter truly began to change. Because the longer Iran held the tanker, the less chaotic the confrontation appeared to the side that was reading it. The scene in the Gulf still looked tense, still unstable, still dangerous. But somewhere inside the destroyer, the encounter was no longer a mystery. It was becoming a problem with a shape. And once a confrontation gains a shape, someone eventually decides where the line is. Then one of the Iranian boats moved in closer. Not a broad sweep, not another warning pass, a committed move. It drove hard toward the tanker's forward quarter, tightening the ring already holding the ship in place. Another boat shifted with it, closing the gap on the opposite side. The perimeter was no longer just surrounding the tanker. It was beginning to reposition it. That mattered, because up to that point, some ambiguity still existed inside the encounter. Pressure had been obvious. Intent had not been fully settled. But this move changed that. Holding the tanker in place was one thing, Starting to control where it would sit, how it would drift, and how tightly the ring would close around it was something else entirely. Inside the U.S. destroyer, that difference was understood immediately. The line had been crossed. On the bridge, officers no longer watched for possibility. They were now watching a confirmed threshold event. Inside the Combat Information Center, the pattern that had been forming for minutes suddenly locked into clarity. The pressure boats were no longer probing. The controlling element was no longer hiding inside the swarm. The geometry around the tanker had become specific, and that specificity changed everything. This was the clarity the U.S. command had been waiting for. Not because it needed more danger, because it needed less ambiguity. And the moment that ambiguity collapsed, the immediate response began. Not as spectacle, as posture. A warning was issued. Then another. The language sharpened. The sequence climbed.
Final warning.
This was no longer distant observation with room for interpretation. The destroyer had shifted from monitoring the confrontation to shaping it. Its course changed, not violently, not theatrically, but decisively. The ship repositioned to alter the space around the tanker, resetting distance across the encounter. What had looked like a closed Iranian-controlled circle was now being cut by a larger and more disciplined frame. Range control changed first. That was the real break. For most of the standoff, Iran had used closeness as a weapon. Fast boats could rush and hold a narrow perimeter and force every decision into dangerous short range. Now that advantage began slipping away. The destroyer's movement changed the geometry of consequence. Every Iranian boat had to recalculate. Every adjustment now carried a clearer cost. Because once the warning ladder had escalated, and once the destroyer had repositioned, uncertainty no longer belonged to Iran. That was the reversal. The seizure itself had not suddenly disappeared. The tanker was still there. The boats were still moving around it. But the logic of the encounter had changed hands. Iran could no longer use uncertainty as a shield. Its boats had already revealed which ones were holding the perimeter, which ones were enforcing pressure, and which movements actually mattered. What had looked like tactical freedom was now a pattern the other side understood. And once understood, it could be managed. The fast boats still had speed, they still had proximity, they still had the ship, but they no longer had the initiative in the same way. Because every next move they made would now happen inside a battle space the U.S. had begun to redefine. A boat edging closer to the tanker no longer looked like pure pressure. It looked exposed. A movement meant to tighten control now risked confirming intent even further. A tactic that had worked in ambiguity was now trapped inside clarity. And that was the hidden cost of the seizure. Iran had forced the encounter into the open. But the moment it crossed the line, the encounter stopped moving on Iranian terms. From there, the crisis was no longer about who had moved first. It was about who now controlled the frame in which every move would be judged. And that was where the pressure began to turn. The tanker was still there. A towering steel hull sitting in the water, its engines low Iranian fast boats still circling nearby. At first glance, almost nothing had changed. The ship had been seized. The boats still held their positions. The crisis had not simply vanished, but the encounter around it was no longer the same. Moments earlier, Iran had used proximity as its advantage. Fast boats cutting close across the tanker's path, controlling distance, forcing every decision into dangerous short range. Now that closeness had become a constraint. Because once the destroyer repositioned and the warning ladder escalated, every movement carried new consequences. A boat edging closer no longer looked like confident pressure. It looked like escalation. And escalation in those waters did not fall evenly on both sides. For Iran, the tanker had been meant as leverage, a symbol sitting in the middle of a vital corridor showing the world that the Gulf could be disrupted. But leverage only works when the situation remains uncertain. Once the encounter became readable, the logic changed. The fast boats still surrounded the ship, but the confrontation itself was no longer theirs to shape. Every maneuver now happened inside a framework defined by the destroyer's presence. Speed still belonged to the smaller craft, but timing had shifted. Iran could still hold the tanker for a moment. What it could not easily hold anymore was the initiative that seizure had promised. Because the move that created pressure had also exposed its structure. The boats that mattered most were known. The distances they preferred were understood. The pattern that once created uncertainty had turned into something measurable, and once measured, it could be managed. That was the quiet consequence of the reversal. The tanker had not suddenly become safe. The tension had not vanished, but the center of control had moved. Visible aggression was no longer driving the encounter. Deliberate management of the battle space was. Iran had taken a ship, but the encounter surrounding it was now unfolding inside boundaries it had not intended to reveal. And that distinction mattered, because in modern naval confrontations, pressure alone rarely decides the outcome. What decides it is knowing exactly when pressure stops creating leverage and starts revealing too much. Iran had seized the tanker, but by then the battle space around it no longer belonged to Iran. At the beginning of the encounter, Iran moved first. Fast boats cutting across the tanker's path, a massive ship held in place, and the narrow waters of the Gulf suddenly under pressure. On the surface, it looked like control. But pressure alone never decides a confrontation like this, because the longer the tanker sat there, the clearer the encounter became to the side that was watching the pattern form. Iran had taken the ship, yet the moment that pressure forced the encounter into the open, the uncertainty that protected it began to disappear. The fast boats still circled the tanker. The water still carried the tension of a crisis. But the confrontation itself was no longer moving on Iranian terms. In the Gulf, control does not belong to the side that moves first. It belongs to the side that understands exactly when the other side has already revealed too much. And by the time that realization became visible, the destroyer was still holding its course in calm, dark water.